My name is Tamara Tolles O'Laughlin, and when I'm not doing my side hustle of landing planes, I'm the executive director of the Maryland Environmental Health Network. We are co-chairs and facilitators of the Environmental Justice Legislative Team, along with Clean Water Action. The team is an open group that welcomes participation from anyone interested in creating a more inclusive and equitable environmental policy landscape. And that isn't just about coming up with good ideas and surfacing them, but figuring out how to embed them in the policy that's being built so that the policy works better. We work together with community advocates, environment and health professionals to specifically focus on environmental inequities in Maryland through the legislative process. The founding members of the Environmental Justice Legislative Team include Blue Water Baltimore, the Beloved Community Church of Chesapeake, Chesapeake Physicians for Social Responsibility, Clean Water Action, CHESPA Maryland, Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake, the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club, and the League of Conservation Voters. The Maryland Environmental Health Network has a fairly broad mission, but we try to focus on it and some really specific interventions. So our mission is to promote the elimination of environmental threats to human health, and our vision is that your status, address, or lack of access to resources does not indicate your level of achievement of health and longevity. And what we value is leveling a playing field for vulnerable populations, which we spend a lot of time working on through partnerships and programs that we build with health and environmental advocates, legislative champions, and vulnerable populations who, for us, are the key to solving any of this work because we can't do it without the folks who are harmed. What we'll cover today is pretty straightforward. We have 90 minutes broken into 3 blocks. The first block will be public health lens. Why are a bunch of folks concerned with environmental health focusing on energy and specifically on clean and renewable energy? Then we'll pivot to talking about community solar, which is our topic for today, and pivot following that to an open discussion. You'll find that you are unmuted and able to speak to everybody who's on the line about your concerns with community solar, the places where you see that it could use more support, why it is or is not reaching your community, and what we should be doing about it. And then we'll follow up with the last 30 minutes where we'll discuss bills that are already in place, emerging bills and proposals, and a question and answer before we close up and discuss when the next briefing will be and any related announcements. We have several partners today. Among them are Earthjustice's Jessica Ennis, the Legislative Director of Climate and Energy. Jessica is a part of the policy and legislative team for Earthjustice and is based out of Washington, D.C. She advocates for protecting people, public lands, and the environment from, she says, potentially devastating impacts, but I'm just going to throw myself on the fire and say that there are definite impacts of oil and gas development for our communities. Jessica's areas of focus include oil and gas development, Arctic oceans, and state renewable policy in Maryland, Colorado, and New Mexico. Our other partner is Chesapeake Climate Action Network's Taylor Smith-Hams. She is the Healthy Communities campaign organizer. She's based out of Baltimore, and when she's not fighting crude oil trains, she's collaborating with community partners to develop access to solar power, which is why we thought she'd be a great person to talk with us today. She grew up in the Bay Area and moved to Baltimore to pursue her education at MICA, and is an artist and an activist working out campaigns for LGBTQ rights, chemical plant safety, carbon pricing, and public financing. She has an incredible background of thinking about environmental impacts and climate change in locations from Vietnam, Morocco, and Bolivia to working on New Economy, Maryland, with the Institute for Policy Studies right here in our own state. So let's talk a little bit about the environmental health lens on energy and renewables. Why wouldn't we be focused on environment and health? People who are exposed to chemical exposures and whose health is lessened by what they come in contact with puts us in a sphere of interest. Climate change is a determining factor and will become an increasingly important one as we look at issues of air pollution, inadequate water and sanitation, chemical pollution, radiation, noise in a community, agricultural practices, and what we choose to build and where we choose to build it. All of that impacts our health, and for that reason alone, we think that it's a moral imperative for environmental health practitioners to get involved in this conversation. Specifically, our lens allows us some room to interrogate what's happening to vulnerable populations, because what occurs inside of us is really indicative of what's happening around us. Environmental health helps us to examine the reasons that it's harder or easier for vulnerable populations to receive or achieve society and cultural thriving. If a community is unable to take advantage of benefits that are around them, we have to ask why that is. It isn't that anybody wants to have any less than a healthy life and longevity. So if we're not reaching that for everybody, then it is imperative that we think about it more critically. What's our goal? We want to lower the likelihood of untimely death and sickness while we help vulnerable populations to achieve positive and meaningful lives of their own making. That sounds really chill, but what we're talking about is self-determination for communities who are experts on their own experience and building in levers for them to access the decisions that are being made that impact their ability to live as long as they can and be as healthy as they possibly can. So why are we thinking about energy? Because what we promote or what we fail to promote impacts the health of generations. This is true from toxic exposure to air quality through transportation, or even focusing on the epigenetic level, which means what you pass on to your children. The stress of your life can be passed on to your children through your genes. So if we are experiencing a lack of agency or a lack of access to decisions, then that lack of access can be transferred to your children, not just because they don't have any more support than you did, but because your own health is impacted and that gets passed on to your future. So we think a lot about what we use as fuel, where and how we look for it, the ways that we access it, and how we refine and transport it as direct impacts on human health. We care a lot about inclusion, and it isn't just because it's cool and people like to talk about it. We care about it because we are a part of communities where a lack of planning, siting, and operations development often fails to include those who are going to be most impacted. We're talking about manufacturing and generation, and it is our firm belief that if we include the folks who are on the ground in the decision making, it actually makes all of this better for everybody. It is difficult to fight people who should be supporting you if you've included them in the process and they help to build a best practice. So we're interested in including communities, not just because it improves their health outcomes and gives them agency and resiliency, but because we actually think it makes policy better. It makes regulations better, and it makes decision-making a real benefit as opposed to setting up unnecessarily adversarial processes. So what are the threats we hear about from our members? We hear about proximity to communities living in the footprint of industrial activity, noise, light, air, and water pollution, and the rise of fossil fuel infrastructure, and specifically natural gas infrastructure in a state that banned fracking. We're also concerned about affordability. A really good friend of mine spends a lot of time thinking about what it means to focus on having to pay your energy bills as opposed to paying for clothes on your back or food on your stomach or the ability to go from your place of work. And this is an increasing problem as we develop a larger basket of solutions for energy. We should be thinking about what affordability means for everybody so that everybody can participate, because everybody is in fact paying in. We're concerned about lack of agency for communities within the footprint of all of the above. And we are concerned about the loss of community that occurs when the land is carved up by people who don't live in the space. Communities are happy to be developed, but to do so without any inclusion of their own experience or what they need, all of that tends to break down the strongest thing we've ever built, which is community. Finally, we're concerned about threats of extreme climate because it exaggerates existing inequalities. If folks are already failing to be served as we are embarking on a new set of decisions around clean energy, what are the likelihood that those new technologies will speak to the folks who are already failing to be served? We're concerned about a lack of state and local health and environmental agencies' responsiveness to community health concerns as they become aware and outline what's happening to them in real time. We are concerned that those agencies are not responding to their requests for local data that protects residents from harm, that underscores what they're experiencing, and that proves it so that we can develop solutions. So we're thinking about not just what we're against, but we are actively promoting what we're for. So we're for a statewide energy choice that lessens climate impacts to protect vulnerable populations. We are here to demand the end of energy choice that exaggerates harms that communities are already feeling, and that local and health agencies respond to those community health concerns, from air quality, water quality, lack of inclusion in decision-making processes. And we are here to support the use of local data, whether it is derived from communities or in connection with communities, to make the case that harm is occurring now or that it's likely to occur. So what is community solar? We've talked about the landscape of issues, and it is important for us to think a little bit about not just the big picture of renewable and clean energy, which could take a lifetime to explain, but what is community solar? What's the proposition? I will talk a little bit about it and then hand it over to Taylor to give us some information about her experience in Baltimore. So what is it? It's a community power plant, a grouping of solar panels that give a community the opportunity to pool the benefits and burdens of taking on clean and renewable energy. So some of the burdens can include how expensive it is, having enough land to set up a set of solar arrays, or just to manage and maintain it. We have to think about what the benefits are to communities who are struggling to make ends meet, and what kinds of solutions exist if people pool their resources. It's a collective solution to energy shortage and to energy, and there are also other benefits, including energy storage, which we're not going to touch on today, but there's a lot to discuss around what it means to combine our assets to create more of a benefit for a larger group of people. Taylor, I'm going to open it up for you to jump in and talk a little bit about what you've been seeing in Baltimore and across the state.
Sure, thank you. So as Tamara has outlined, and given a lot of context, we've been working on community solar partly as a component of our work in addressing climate change in the Chesapeake region. So I work for the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. I'm our Healthy Communities campaign organizer. And I work primarily in Baltimore City. And one of the reasons that we are so excited about community solar is as a great solution to addressing the climate crisis. So in Baltimore and across Maryland, as most of you I'm sure know, we are already experiencing and will expect to experience more extreme temperatures, more like increased heavy rainfall. We've had one of the wettest years on record this year, and all of that has really detrimental impacts, and we've seen that arise in the city, especially with sewage backups in people's basements. It has all types of effects on people's everyday lives when we have this extreme weather. And then it, of course, also contributes to increased incidence of asthma and other respiratory illnesses, which are already a big problem in Baltimore. Next slide. Great. And so because we are facing a climate crisis, and because we have, there are great alternatives out there, such as wind and solar, so we don't need to be relying on dirty fossil fuels that pollute our communities, that contribute to a public health crisis, and that are putting our climate in danger. But unfortunately, these renewable energy sources have not historically been accessible or affordable. For example, in Maryland, only 1% of residential solar has actually been installed in communities with a median income below $40,000. So if we are going to be building a just transition to clean energy, if we are going to be able to address the climate crisis at the speed with which we need to make sure that a lot more people have access to solar power than what is currently available. And so community solar is it's a great strategy to do that. So just a little bit of an overview of what community solar can mean for Baltimore in terms of building a just transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. In Maryland, we've already seen that there are over 5,000 folks who are already working in the solar industry. With community solar, we will have more. And there are programs in Baltimore like the Baltimore Center for Green Careers, which provide the training that you need in order to enter this field. Because again, we have to make sure that as we're building this transition, that those jobs that are being created are accessible. And in terms of expanding access to solar power, about 50 to 75% of households don't have access to rooftop solar panels. So for example, I live in an apartment building. I can't put solar panels on my roof because I don't own it. That's a big barrier for a lot of folks. Some people who do own their homes, they might live in an old row house that's not structurally sound, or the company isn't going to come and put solar panels on that roof. Or you might have a great house, but you have a bunch of trees that cast shade on your roof, so you can't go solar. So there's all these barriers to going solar, and community solar is a way to expand access so that the rest of us who don't have access to rooftop solar panels can go solar. So the way that it works, Tamara went over this a little bit, but I can give another overview using this very handy chart from Maryland Sun. So panels are installed on a site. So think a field or a big building, maybe a library or a big warehouse, somewhere where there's a lot of space. So solar panels are installed there. That energy goes into the grid. And then you, as a community solar customer, you sign up with a community solar provider. And you can subscribe for however much of your electricity that you want to use. So you can choose to get 50% of your energy from a community solar project. You can get 100%, whatever you want. You can sign up to get whatever percentage that you want from community solar to your house, and then you pay your community solar provider for that. And then that whatever you're paying gets taken off of your bill. So if you're in Baltimore, from BG&E. And then you're getting access to this clean solar power, and then you're also saving money. All of the community solar projects that have gone online so far are guaranteeing savings, usually between 5 to 10% lower from what you're typically being offered from your utility.
I also just wanted to tell you, Taylor, I really like the visual, because I think it goes a long way to explaining that it isn't just that you have a good idea. It really walks you through how you manage to go from that idea to implementing it in your community. So thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are just some of the general benefits of switching to community solar. So again, no upfront equipment or payments. You don't have to put the panels on your own roof. You are just subscribing to a project that is being built. You get cheaper utility bills. You are also contributing to new jobs being created in your community. And you're getting, as Tamara mentioned earlier on, like that energy choice, knowing where your energy is coming from and being able to take ownership over that. Community solar really offers that path. And then you also get to build community by investing in a project together with your neighbors.
So is there any more you want to say about that before we open it up? Because I do think there are some folks on the line who likely have some opinions about this, and the panelists are open to speaking with them. But I also think it's just really important to think about what the benefits are to everybody who could possibly participate, and potentially talk about some of the reasons why we haven't necessarily seen more participation from communities, if that's in fact an issue. And you'll find that at this moment, I'm unmuting your sound, so you should be able to participate should you have a question or any experience that you'd like to share. But I will open it up now after focusing on just a couple of the things that we've noticed as an environmental health organization working in this space. Any other thoughts about that, Taylor, before I pivot?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so let me just, oops. We have heard communities talk a little bit about their concerns with overlap with other clean energy policies. People are concerned that net metering, tax credits, and other policies that are out there don't necessarily consider them. And we've also heard communities talk about the benefits. They're excited about potential bill savings, the change in the cost of electricity, and wider accessibility, but with a huge asterisk, which is that the projects have to think about set-asides for low-income customers, what will benefit the grid as a whole, how we might comply with the state renewable portfolio standards, and what best practices there are to help people with financing, because that has been a barrier to some extent. Just want to make sure. Oh, it looks like we might have a question here. Yes, folks who are interested in participating should feel free to type in any questions they have. If you're in a loud space, feel free to send us a note and just let us know what your questions are, and we'll do whatever we can. Taylor, do you want to introduce the gentleman that you wanted to participate in this section?
Sure. I can't see if everyone is
Keto?
Yeah, great. So yeah, Keto, James with Neighborhood Sun. Keto, if you want to hop in and help answer some of these questions, that would be great.
Sure. I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Perfectly.
Okay, perfect. Yes, I am a business development consultant for Neighborhood Sun. We're based in Silver Spring, Maryland, and we are. Sometimes it feels like a corporation, Silver Spring, but
Jinx, I owe you a Coke. I was going to say the same thing. It's so.
But yes, in particular, I work with the low and moderate income community. And just going back to 2015, the Community Solar Act, actually, our legislators had foresight that low moderate income individuals were being challenged when they sought solar, and many wanted to be renewable, but there were cost barriers. So there is actually a set aside for these community solar projects for low moderate income individuals. At Neighborhood Sun, we offer in the Baltimore territory, BG&E specifically, we're able to offer a 15% discount. So any individual who fits the low and moderate income federal guidelines, which roughly, just to give you an idea, for an individual is roughly about anyone making $52,000 or less. Mm-hmm. They are able to take advantage of this 15% discount off of their current BG&E rate. So there was foresight put into this legislation. We are still, you all may have mentioned it, we are still in the pilot stages of this community solar initiative. And we expect other benefits and other opportunities in the future. But right now, yes, low and moderate income individuals are able to receive a deeper savings.
Can I ask you, are you seeing any reticence from communities? And that's open for Taylor, Keto, or Jessica. Are you hearing from communities that they are excited about this as we are? Are you hearing that there are barriers to entry, or what are common questions that communities have when offered this opportunity? Because it can be a lot to have someone knocking on your door, or however you might hear about it. I think it can be a lot to parse if you aren't thinking about this all day, every day like we are.
Yes, that's a great point. Actually, I was at a community event this weekend on Saturday, and I had a great discussion with an individual. And one of the things, who's in the solar industry, and one of the things we talked about that is a barrier, especially for low and moderate income individuals, is just really the trust factor. As you know, for the last 10 years, energy has been deregulated in the state of Maryland. And we've had a slew of third-party energy suppliers, knocking on folks' doors, making calls, and some folks have gotten burned, frankly, those offers. So they've seen their rate spike after an initial teaser rate. So really trust and sort of explaining how community solar works, and that it's really to some extent, controlled by the community. Really, that trust factor I've found to be probably the biggest barrier for the low and moderate income community. I guess second would be just the education, because some people may be vaguely familiar with rooftop solar. The community solar concept is a little different. So I find, and this is across the board, I could literally 30 seconds earlier say there are no panels required on your house or your apartment building. And the first question I would get is, so how many panels will I need, or how much are the panels? Just explaining that this is really a very seamless option. That I would say the educational component about community solar would be the second hurdle.
I guess I'll ask, are there any, how is a community approached about community solar? If I wanted my community to get involved, what would be the very first thing that I need to do? And what's the likelihood that I would feel like I have the capacity to do it based on your experience with people like having access to this capacity?
Well, the big thing we do is partner. We seek to partner with, we've partnered with Taylor and CCAN. We've partnered with other organizations, nonprofits, for-profit entities. So partnership is what we've found to be successful thus far. So that entails really just talking to community leaders, talking to the heads of nonprofits, corporations, and seeing what really best fits for them in terms of communicating with their populations. Last week, I attended a community association meeting in central Baltimore. Mm-hmm. And, prior to that meeting, I reached out to the president. He thought it was something that could benefit his community. And I gave a presentation and, was able to talk to a few folks afterwards that had no idea that this was even, this even existed. So really just connecting with individuals. We have two projects in the Baltimore region, one in the Owens Mills community, as well as another in the Westminster area. So we have the project set up. It's really simply a matter of communities, finding out and raising awareness within their networks, within their circles.
Are there differences between incorporated communities having access to this versus communities that are not incorporated, between how urban Maryland and rural Maryland might be seeing this opportunity, and whether or not people are looking to participate at different rates? And that's open to the whole panel.
Taylor, did you want to start, or?
Sure. I think, so in terms of incorporated versus non-incorporated, that's, you're just signing up as an individual, like with, as long as you need bill. So anyone can sign up. You don't have to sign up like with an entity of any type, if that helps.
Awesome.
In terms of perception, so again, I work primarily in the city, and I would definitely echo what Keto has said in terms of trust and just like lack of information being the biggest barriers. And then in more rural areas, there has been some concerns about land use. There have been moratoriums placed in a few counties as kind of in opposition to community solar projects. And I think a lot of that also has to do with lack of information. Seeing these are pretty small projects. They're no bigger than 2 megawatts. But sometimes folks will hear about like a ground mounted solar array, and they'll think that it's a big industrial solar farm, and they might not want that, or might be challenging to some, if it's, primarily been agricultural land, that has been something that's come up in some communities. So working to address that, working to show that this is, these are much smaller projects, and that they really do offer a lot of benefits to communities as well, and just having more collaboration. That's what I would say.
Keto, have you noticed any specific benefits that, because Taylor hit the nail on the head in terms of what the concerns are in agricultural spaces, at the Maryland Environmental Health Network, we think a lot about that as an opportunity for more for more urban participation, mostly through parking lot solar or rooftop solar or brownfield solar. Can you talk a little bit more about whether community solar would be appropriate for any of these, or if urban populations have a benefit that could be realized?
Definitely. I'll take a step back and talk about the big picture. I think many in the environmental community, long term, they want, or we would want, our energy to be produced as locally as possible. So I think that has tremendous future benefit for urban communities, where as we currently see community gardens popping up everywhere in the urban landscape. Community solar can also sort of mimic that. So yes, rooftop, landfills. There's another group working in Baltimore City currently to build a solar array on a landfill in the city.
Well,
so
give them a shout out. We're agnostic.
It's a little, they're in negotiations, so they may not want me to be too specific.
Sure.
I've had conversations with them, and it's the long-term view, the long play of this. Like I said, we're in the pilot stage, but the long play is for folks to literally, within 3 to 5 miles, be able to manage a solar or whatever renewable energy project, but generate their energy, their power as local as possible. So that would entail rooftops, not just building rooftops, but also parking lot rooftops. That's something else to consider. So there are a lot of options. We have in the PEPCO territory, we're utilizing a landfill that Prince George's County was not utilizing, and that's where that PEPCO project is being built. So there are a lot of options here, and we definitely, to your point, we also want to preserve open space and agricultural land. So our preference is unusable land, established infrastructure. So we definitely sympathize with the open space, point.
Yeah, I think it's an underutilized way to think about this, because we don't want to have public conversations about the fact that there are entire swaths of unusable land that we should not build people's homes on or allow people to be around because of contamination, because of previous uses. We do a lot of work in spaces where open pit burning used to be a thing that happened in that space, where it was a dumping ground for materials or munitions, and people have continuing exposures to industry that doesn't even exist there anymore. And so if there are these giant plots of land that we should be thinking about as places where people should not go, we have to think about what the other possible use could be. And if this is the sort of thing that isn't going to cause harm to anyone to put up, it is a thing we should be thinking about. The other thing is we've heard from some folks in the chat box who asked about our communities feeling strain and pressure about signing on to long-term contracts. Is that an area where people are feeling sensitive? So I'll ask if you guys have any thoughts on that before I move to our next comment that was in the chat box.
I'll just quickly speak to that. Yes, there are individuals that would rather not, commit to a longer term contract. But I think we're all individuals in that sense. Some folks see the benefit of locking in a particular rate for a long period of time. Other people prefer flexibility.
Can you break down what's a long-term contract? What does that mean? And if I am a person who's considering signing up for solar in my community, how long am I on the table for this kind of proposition?
Well, just using our current offerings, you can commit for as short as 3 years. Also have another developer that offers a 25-year.
Okay.
contract. So it really, right now, 3, 5, and 25 generally the terms that you're going to find. So yeah, it's all up to the individual, what they prefer. We found that renters, for example, they're more interested in a 3-year contract,
Mm-hmm.
whereas homeowners who are maybe retired, older, citizens, they love the 25-year commitment. So it really varies.
Okay, because we've heard some folks who are a little concerned about 25 years. So I'm happy to know that that's anecdotal. That's not something that's happening across the board, or that we should at least investigate what the barriers are for folks at different spaces. There's also a note from the folks. There's a group of folks at a couple of different pockets of University of Maryland who are tuned in. There are a couple of folks who are watching this as their brown bag lunch, and there are also folks at the University of Maryland School Environmental Law program who are working on an environmental justice project to create a toolkit for communities on climate change adaptation. And their note says, we believe solar is a vital step in providing equal distribution and access to clean energy for disadvantaged communities in Baltimore. What information or companies should communities be pointed to in order to be familiar with this process?
Taylor?
Sure, yeah. So I think in terms of information, just knowledge about Maryland's pilot programs, I think just to fill that gap, I don't know if we have talked about that actually. We have so Maryland has a 3-year pilot program right now to essentially look at can community solar work in Maryland. And there's a cap of 200 megawatts throughout the course of that 3-year program. We're just kind of into the first year right now. And at CCAN, our perspective is, we really want to make sure that the pilot program is successful, that we address concerns that are coming up during that, so that, after the end of the pilot, we can go back to the legislature and say, okay, here's what we learned. We should make this program permanent, expand it, and make these changes.
And the delegate who's sponsoring that legislation, he'll be on the call shortly, and I think he'll probably fill in a little bit more and a little bit about the background legislation and the future legislation. So I'm super psyched that you pointed us in that direction. But
so that's just kind of some general information. If you're talking with people about community solar, we are in this pilot phase, as Keto has mentioned, and it's a response to a lot of what we've talked about already: this lack of access to solar power, and the need to be moving rapidly to clean energy. And in terms of companies, just knowing there are a lot of what are called subscriber organizations, so solar developers that have registered with the Public Service Commission to develop community solar projects. So you can get a full list of that on the PSC's website. You can also look at you can break it down by utilities. Like each utility that's participating has a page on their website about community solar. So you could go to BG&E's page to learn more about what companies are participating. And then you also can talk to specific companies like Neighborhood Sun for more specific information.
So Keto, can you talk to us a little bit about the difference between a developer's role and the individual person, and what Neighborhood Sun is doing about this specifically? Because
Okay.
I think Taylor represents sort of the larger push to get people in more generally, but you have a specific role, and could you talk to us about that?
Well, at Neighborhood Sun, we view ourselves as solar advocates, and that's generally, what you'll find from the subscriber organizations. So our job is to, dovetail with what Taylor and other environmental leaders are doing, and really let people know that, again, that this is actually happening, that this is real. The legislation was passed, 3 years ago, so some people have lost track of the actual offering. So that's what we do. We raise awareness. Obviously, we provide the customer service for individuals to sign up, to ask questions. We're out in the community. The developer, their job is to get the financing for these projects and build them. So the developers, we partner with the developers, and as Taylor mentioned, 200 megawatts are out there. So you have a lot of developers jockeying to get these projects off the ground. But they are the, financiers as well as the builders of the actual solar arrays.
I want to talk a little bit more about that, just because from the perspective of communities, I am always thinking about what are the equity issues? How many layers does it take before at what point does a community member have agency? Do they have options for joining up for community solar? Is there an opportunity that is there a version of this that is more equitable than others, even without naming names? Just what's the most equitable way to participate in community solar? Because communities are offered a lot of things, and some of the offerings are more like being voluntold. And so in terms of even doing things that are in your best interest, what's the most equitable way to enter into this kind of project?
And I don't know, Taylor, if you want to chime in, but I would say, the equitable portion, I think it's happening now. But as I said, because this is a pilot, I think this is going to grow and become more localized. So I think the equity naturally will be increased by that process. But right now, I do think that, the equity, as Taylor mentioned, is this does create local jobs right now. So, local jobs will be created. So it's not just individuals generically, switching over to solar, which is important, but it's tangibly creating jobs. I think second, I would say that, just the participation and the sort of community organizing benefit of this changes the paradigm. We're so used to just paying a bill and having someone else provide us with power, this sort of big conglomerate model. But this is really decentralizing our lives. And I think that has benefit when you talk about community empowerment and equity, frankly. So I think the more decentralized we become, the more empowered, frankly, we have more opportunity to become more empowered.
Sure, and there are models that aren't utility owned, that aren't third party owned. Communities can create their own pools of community solar. Is that right?
Yes, definitely. The gentleman that I mentioned that are meeting with the city currently on a former landfill or lot, that's their focus, and they want to be first to market in Baltimore City, and they are tremendously driven by the equity and community empowerment piece. So, most of our developers we're working with are looking at 2 to 5 megawatt systems.
Can you talk about how big is that? Just for folks who happen on this conversation, I don't want them to walk away with the question like, what is a megawatt? How much service is that? How many power walls is that? I went to the Tesla area in the mall and I punched in my square footage and I don't even know what that says. So just can you break that down a little bit?
Well, visually, a 2 megawatt system would require about 10 to 12 acres of land, if you can envision that many panels. And, pretty much that could provide about 300 to 400 power 300 to 400 homes with an average use of 5 kilowatts per month per individual. So 5 megawatt, you're looking at about 25 acres on the high end. But, there are groups out there that are pushing for a 500 kilowatt system, which would require, maybe 4 acres of land, a smaller plot of land. So that is where, the more localized opportunity is with maybe a 500 to a 1 megawatt system. 500 kilowatt to one megawatt system.
Awesome. Taylor, hey, Jessica.
Okay, I just wanted to jump in really quickly, and we have gotten very detailed about some of these projects, but I think one of the great things about community solar, just to underscore all of it, is there are lots of different models, and community solar allows for flexibility. So if you band together with a bunch of your neighbors, it is possible to do this with your neighbors. I've heard a couple stories from other states about church congregations getting together and building community solar projects on their roofs, and then the church is one of the main electricity off takers, and then there's also the congregation can also participate. So I think the one piece that we should be really clear about is these are some specific projects, but there's tons of flexibility in how this can be actually implemented. Yeah, sorry to jump in.
No, we're actually pivoting to you right after this. We are getting some lights. You guys, I don't know if you can see it in the chat box. I think keto folks are curious about if you could dig in a bit more to what Neighborhood Sun adds. Like, how does this flatten the process for communities? What is the benefit to a community? I know some folks here have mentioned that they've been burned by some groups, and I think you mentioned it when you talked about a teaser rate and then skyrocketing costs later. Can you delve into that and why having a Neighborhood Sun involved helps the process or helps to flatten the educational need? What is the benefit for communities?
Well, I'll give some background on Neighborhood Sun, which I hope brings some credibility to us.
Sure.
We're a B Corporation, so we have a tremendous standard and personal mission to be as transparent, as community-oriented, community empowering as possible. So we're a registered B Corporation, and that is done intentionally. Second, our purpose is to provide, again, the outreach, the awareness, but also the education. So when you sign any of these contracts, whether it's a 3, 5-year, 25-year contract, it is a fixed rate. So that is written into the contract. Whether you're going to save 5% annually, 15% annually, whatever it is, that is a locked-in rate. So that is a big difference. As I said, many of the third-party suppliers that we've all been introduced to, whether clean or dirty energy, last 10 years, that is not the case. Many of them offer teaser rates, and within 6 months to a year, in many cases, those rates go up. So we are transparent in what we're offering you. I think that's a benefit. By our our corporate setup, it's required, but also those are our values. But it's really we like to consider ourselves the advocates. So not only just for solar, but also for the community, for the individual who is entrusting us to be part of the project, the particular project.
Thank you. And we got our last question before we move into talking about the policy and legislative landscape to deal with some of these questions and challenges and the barriers to entry that we've touched on a bit here. Can any one of the panelists and speakers talk to us about examples of a community solar project that is also a microgrid project, so that if the larger grid fails, the backup is clean energy? Are there any currently in Maryland to speak of?
There aren't any that I'm aware of, but that's something that I would really like to see us be moving towards, especially as the climate crisis worsens, as we have more severe storms. Microgrids are increasingly important. And I think that community solar is a really great entry point into creating microgrids. I don't know if there's anyone else who could add more about what it would take to move from a community solar project to a microgrid. That's not necessarily my area of expertise, but I would really like to see that happen.
And I'll just to make sure we explain all the terms, a microgrid is a decentralized form of electricity. It's what we had before we unified the grid. So what's old is new again. We're going back to doing it in ways that that provide real benefits to people without providing without exposing them to failures of the entire grid and being able to back that up. One example of this is that communities in Puerto Rico, and some of the outside work that I do, we've talked to communities in Puerto Rico who have asked the question of what happens if an entire grid fails and your backup is a bunch of diesel generators. What are the air quality impacts of that? What are the long-term impacts on community health when the thing you're using to give you basic services to keep the machines that keep you alive or just your refrigerator going aren't clean? So I agree with you, Taylor, that it's important, whether we're talking about the Eastern Shore or Puerto Rico or Baltimore City, to have backups that aren't exasperating air quality issues that we're already concerned about. But I'll make space for other folks to answer the original question.
Yeah, this is Jess. I know there's one project in Philadelphia that is, it's structured sort of like a community solar project, but they don't actually have enabling legislation, so it's a little more complicated.
Wow.
But it is being built with specific off-takers, and it's being built as a microgrid. I will see if I can find a write-up on that and circulate it to the group. I've just heard about it through word of mouth. But I
Awesome.
think I agree with Taylor. It's a great model going forward. And if we can figure out ways to do that and ways to be more inclusive, I mean, we all saw in Puerto Rico how long it took to get the lights back on, and that was completely unacceptable. And this would be a way to move more quickly when you have giant like transmission lines down.
Yes, and in a universe where this is only going to continue to happen, it is a proactive concern, because we're not like the threat isn't just isn't as far away as it seems like. Carl Benson has asked us, does the Maryland enabling legislation preclude microgrids? Does anybody feel comfortable answering that question, or should we wait until we move into the next section, because we may jump on it, but since it popped up, we thought it was a good time to ask.
I don't think it precludes it. I don't know if the financial incentives were put into the bill to make it feasible, but I think it precludes it. But I'm not 100% sure.
Jessica, Taylor, thank you, Keita.
Yeah, I don't think it precludes it, but I will pull it up and find out very quickly.
Awesome.
And I don't know what the microgrid requirements are in Maryland, so that would be easy enough to follow up offline about.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're happy to. This is a continuing conversation and just the first of many. I will move us along, but I thank you, Keto, for joining us to talk about your work and how it enters into the space and how it informs what the environmental community is doing, and for Taylor for helping us to frame it. We're going to start to move towards what the policies that have formed around this conversation, just so that we can fill in the participants and all of the information and background that we have in this space. But just want to say thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, Robin Lewis raised her hand. Hold on a second. It's one of my two favorite Robins, named Lewis. Let's see. Gonna look and see what their questions were before we move on. Robin, do you want to speak up? Let me make sure that you are able to. Give us just 1 second. Yeah, Robin's on the phone, and I'll just open up her mic so that she can speak to everybody. Robin, go ahead.
Okay, there we go. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Wonderful. Yeah, I just wanted to mention there is a talk about a microgrid, but more for disaster recovery in Prince George's County. I talked to Erica Bannerman about it a little bit, and she's, the sustainability manager for the county. So, of course, we might want to help influence that construction to be more clean, because, I don't know what they're going to use, what they're looking at. But since they're looking at it, we might as well kind of try to insert ourselves into that process and push them to do clean energy. So
fantastic. And that strikes exactly at the heart of what we were talking about, which is that it isn't just a matter of solving problems, but finding a way of solving problems that doesn't add to the current climate of injustice, or knock the heels out from under communities who are asking for a clean response, not just a response.
Thanks.
Thanks
Yep.
so much, Robin. And on that, I'll move us towards the discussion of policy and legislative proposals. And by giving us a little bit of background, Taylor, Keto, and Jessica all touched on it, that this community solar conversation is happening in other spaces. To date, the nation has about 734 megawatts of community solar. That's 228 utilities in 36 states, just to give you a sense of scale. And 387 megawatts of that capacity was built in 2017, which means we've had like 100% growth in the amount that we had just last year. Minnesota and Massachusetts represent more than 50% of the community solar, which means there's room for another M state to get in there and get some stuff done. And Minnesota is the nationwide leader with 1/3 of the capacity, and Massachusetts is second. So I do think, given that our goal is some 200 megawatts, and there are requests to expand that to 500, we really have a lot of room to grow in this space. And given how much unusable land we have, I think we should be looking at all of those spaces as spaces where we could potentially do this work. Just to give a little bit of background on the agency that focuses some dollars in this space, the Maryland Energy Administration, by their own calculations, has said they have awarded over $3 million in grant funding in fiscal year 2018, and will donate and will allocate. It's not a donation because it's your money. It's regional greenhouse gas dollars being pumped back into the state. So it's not charity, it's your own money. Allocating $1 million of those dollars for 2019 just to support community solar pilot programs implemented by the Public Service Commission. And their stance on it is that these kind of incentives are going to enable Marylanders to purchase more solar energy by helping to get over the initial costs of doing that work. There are some bills that our speakers have alluded to, but I'll wait until we are joined by the sponsor of that legislation, Delegate Clippinger. So I'll move us to Jessica, if you don't mind. Your slides are up, so we're on slide 1. If you want to talk a little bit about your work in community solar in the state of Maryland, and what the emerging proposals are and have been.
Yeah, that sounds great. Although I think the delegate might be on.
Oh, okay. That would be awesome. Let me just check my console. Yeah, he is on. Let's unmute him. Delegate Clippinger?
Modern technology, does it work?
Yes, it totally does. I have no idea how, but yes, it totally does.
Okay.
You're on with a good portion of Maryland who is learning a lot about how community solar can be useful. And what we have been alluding to a few times is that there was prescient legislation in 2015 and 2018. I have some slides on some of that. So what I'll do is I'll try to open up some space for you to talk about the history, what the present proposals are for community solar, why should we do it here and now, and leave some space for you to just talk about why we need more people to support it and what the best outcomes will be. And what I'll do is I'll flash the slides that we have on the legislation as it's pertinent. Does that sound fair?
That's great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here.
Sure. Again, I'm Luke Clippinger. I represent South and Southeast Baltimore City in the House of Delegates. For the last 4 years, I've served on the Economic Matters Committee. And in 2015, as was mentioned, we passed the legislation that set up a pilot program for community solar in the state of Maryland. It is the program, I think, has enormous potential to enable more Marylanders to participate in the green economy and to generate their own electricity. And that may sound straightforward, but it really is that straightforward. The challenge has been, the program has been, I would say, slow getting off the ground. The regulations that have been drafted have taken a little bit longer than I think people might have liked. And it's in effectively its second year of the pilot. So let me take a step back. Community solar basically says, as opposed to someone who, if you live in your own home and you have roof space, or you have some space on your property where you want to put solar panels up, you can do that. You can then see the electricity that is generated counted against your bill. It's called net metering. So it's a great advantage to people who want to take advantage of generating their own electricity. And in the long term, it can be if not an investment, it certainly can be a savings for electric bills. The idea behind community solar is, well, let's say you don't have access to a roof to put the panels on. You don't have access to the space, or you rent your home, or you don't have enough to build an entire solar array. This allows you to purchase part of a panel somewhere else, or engage with a company who is building a solar array somewhere else. You can get the benefit of generating the solar electricity somewhere else on your electric bill. The potential, particularly for low and moderate income Marylanders, is huge. It's a major one very important way, as I see it, for people to. One of the things I've talked about is to build equity in your electricity. One of the pieces of legislation passed last year is a small piece of legislation, but it is one way that we could be supporting community solar a little bit more. I'm not sure if you have this one or not. Yes, you do. It sets up modern technology staring at the phone. The slide says what the bill does. The bottom line is there is a surplus in the money that we have that pays arrearages for low-income Marylanders, people who get behind on their bill. The thought is, since we have a surplus in that fund, we'd like to take $750,000 of that money and put it into a program that effectively that program actually isn't directly connected to community solar, but would expand the availability of solar or access to solar for low-income people who would have otherwise qualified for the assistance for arrearages. The idea being, if you can get people plugged into solar and they're generating their own electricity, they shouldn't need as much help with arrearages. If we can do that, admittedly slowly and over time, that can help alleviate some of the challenges that low and moderate income families face in the cost of utilities, which make up a very large percentage of their income.
So it sounds a little bit like when we were going over this slide, we changed every time we saw the word arrearages to debt, just to make sure everybody is on the same page about what we're talking about here. But it sounds like you've touched on the equity piece, which is that it allows you to have some ownership in the ways that you are already interacting with the grid. And it gives you another option to deal with debt. And so this next piece of legislation looks at dollars that could be made to work in service of that. Is that right?
Yes, the community solar program, when it was created, didn't directly address issues related to arrearages or debt. The program not really a program, the money that we fenced off in the 2018 budget that's there basically speaks to using that surplus for that one specific purpose for this one or two specific fiscal years.
Okay. Awesome.
But the bottom line, the bigger picture in the end is the challenges that we face are kind of the next step, and we do face some challenges. We have a lot of there's a need for education out there, and that people don't understand exactly how this works and exactly how people can plug in to these programs. And there are a lot of good organizations that are out there trying to work on that. there's just the newness is just in general a challenge. And then in some cases, sometimes there's been a challenge with a perception that you've got to sign on for 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
And some people don't know where they're going to be living in 25 years. A lot of people don't know where they're going to be living in 25 years, for that matter. And so that adds a complexity level that's a little confusing. On top of that, one of the other bigger challenges is projects are being constructed specifically for low and moderate income people.
Mm-hmm.
It one of the critical pieces of that is ensuring that credit, that there is some access to credit, and that's one of the bigger challenges we face nationally is access to reasonable credit for low and moderate income people. It stands as a barrier in some cases to these projects, and that's another issue that has come up through the creation of this program.
And
so one of the things, go ahead.
As an environmental health organization, those are the two things we hear the most about is like, how am I going to make forecasts when I'm worried about climate change eroding my backyard as it is? I might not have a choice in whether I can continue to live where I live. And the other thing people have said is that, so projecting is problematic, but also those dollars, like what happens. And I've spoken a lot to you and Jessica just about the idea that there are some models in other places to think about this guaranteeing the amount of money that you have to pay if you either don't keep the subscription or if you make a longer term contract. And it's interesting to ask you, is Maryland considering incentivizing or supporting or at least encouraging people to think about other models where it's either utility supported or nonprofit supported, and nonprofits can include, your house of worship? There are some rabbis on this call.
So there are some organizations, I don't know if Lynn Heller's on this call, that are working on ways to create funds that would effectively back up the costs of credit and lower the price of credit for low-income people. And the Baltimore Shines project is another example of organizations coming together to effectively underwrite the cost of the debt for low-income people so that they can take advantage of cheaper money to participate in these programs. So there are some options out there. They're not necessarily done legislatively, but there are some people out in the world doing that here in Maryland.
Fantastic. Can I ask you a final question?
Sure.
How would successful implementation support community growth, just generally, because you are a legislator, but you live in a community and you serve that community? And how would that growth support the state's plan for increasing renewables? Because there are some pretty heated conversations about no one is unsure that we need to increase the amount of renewables, but how does community solar relate to all that talk that's happening in the halls where decisions are made?
Well, I mean, it does open up a new group of people first who may, it's difficult to look at it exactly this way, but there's certainly people who could already afford community solar or afford to put solar on their house, but for whatever reason can't. And they can't put it on there because either maybe their house is facing the wrong way, or they live in a condo or something along those lines. Community solar definitely can help to expand the amount of solar that's being generated in Maryland because it gives those people an option to join the marketplace. So that is a positive thing. The clear benefit for low income people is again it's hugely expensive to be poor, and if we can find ways to alleviate that while at the same time expanding the amount of or the availability of solar facilities, that's what we should be doing. And so, I mean, to that end, I think that the legislature over the next several years is going to be looking at this program a lot closer. Certainly, there's going to be an effort to increase the renewable portfolio standard in the next 4 years. And this could play a role or could be part of that, or maybe not. It's hard to say. This program still is in its infancy, and it's still, I think, is going to need to grow a little bit. The current issue with community solar is that we have to find a way to I think, extend the length of the pilot so that we can truly the Public Service Commission, as part of the pilot, is doing a study that is going to seek to talk about the program and how it's working and how it's not. And one of the things that I have observed, and I think others have observed, is that it's not. We need some more time to let this build out, and let it and let people get into this space and truly understand, because understand what community solar is. That lack of education and understanding is making it a little bit harder to get it up and moving. And again, we're in the second year. They're supposed to have a study done shortly, and so for that end, it makes some sense. I should say it's supposed to have a study done in 2019. I think extending the pilot, giving it a chance to kind of work through some of the initial issues is important. So anyway, with that.
So it looks like that's what's next. You're saying what's next is that we're going to extend the pilot. Is there a target number of projects? I said that was my last question, but this is an incredibly exciting topic, so I take the
I've oh my goodness, I've just spontaneously forgotten the number of megawatts that we have. We could talk about that here in a second, maybe, but
sure, yeah.
Yeah, but there's a cap, and there's a cap on the size of community solar projects. There's a cap on the size of each individual project and of the projects as a whole. And if memory serves, it's about 155, 160 megawatts. That's a lot of capacity, and there has been a lot of interest out there in moving these projects. Right now, one of the biggest challenges has been subscribers, just getting people signed up. And again, that goes back to the other issues that we've been talking about.
Well, thank you so much. I'm just really grateful that we were able to have your real-time feel about the landscape and what's happening going forward. I'm going to invite you to hang out in case you want to jump in some more. But I just want to say thank you, because I know your schedule is very tight and you may not be able to stay with us. But this has been just a really great entry point for one of several necessary conversations about community solar and about the landscape of renewables. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
And we'll move into Jessica, if you want to follow up on where the delegate has taken us and about some of these proposals. And I'll just leave the mics open for the panelists in case we want to weigh in the question and answer section, or just as we start to draw to a close.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I think we got a good picture already of how community solar works. So why don't we jump to, I think it's the next slide that, and we've talked about where it exists. I think one thing to underscore, Maryland was a really early adopter of community solar, and one of the great things about being an early adopter is you're looked at as a model, but you can also look at the other states and other places that are working on this and learn from other places. So it was really exciting when the pilot legislation passed, and now we'll be coming back in the future and figuring out how to tweak the program and see what lessons we can learn from other places. And I know that other states are already looking at Maryland as a model on just getting this program off the ground. I think we actually also already talked about these, the goals of community solar. So I think there's one more slide. Yes, this is one I was looking for. So we have talked a bit about the challenges with ensuring low income participation in community solar. And this is part of the learning that we've all done as organizations working across the country and in various places. It's become really clear that this credit piece is important. So these are on this list, you'll just see some of the particular ways that it might be behoove Maryland to add additional money for LMI projects. So Maryland does have a carve out, so it's a the details for that are on the next slide, so we'll go there. But just know that Maryland does have a carve out. Other states have tried putting incentives in or adders. So saying that like you get a certain amount of credit for clean energy programs through Maryland's RPS. In some states, they've actually added like you get 1.5% credit or 2% credit if this is a low-income community solar project. So that's something the state could look at. Also, individual specific programs. I'm doing some work in Pennsylvania right now, and we're looking at existing utility assistance programs because they're very large in Pennsylvania, and there are ways to leverage those existing funds that are already being funneled through the utilities, and instead of having those funds go to coal-fired power that's already on the grid, are there ways to replace that coal or other dirty fuel power generation with community solar? So that's another thing that we're looking, that Earthjustice has been looking at in coalition with partners in other states. And I think it's a good starting point for the next steps in Maryland on really ensuring that this is an inclusive program as it goes through its growing pains. You can pop to the next slide. Yeah, this is just a quick kind of rundown of the regulations that came out of the Public Service Commission after the implementing legislation was passed. So about 218 megawatts available for projects, and that was tiered across, that was divided up by utility territory. So if you live in BGE territory, they have a certain amount of that 218 megawatts. And one of the big wins was getting the full retail rate credit, as if you get the credit as a subscriber to a community solar project as if you did have solar on your roof and were taking advantage of the net energy metering policy that exists in Maryland. Now, I think the part where this gets a little wonky and tough to understand potentially are the buckets. Like the Public Service Commission had carve-outs for individual project categories. So the low and moderate income carve-out was 30% of the total capacity. There was an open category, and then there was a small project in brownfields category. So that was a way to ensure that, I think that was the Public Service Commission's attempt to make sure that we were getting a diversity of projects, and it wasn't just like not all the projects were in the same utility territory in the same model, because a big part of community solar that's so new is the learning and like what works, what doesn't work, like how are there ways that we can make sure that more people who want to participate in these programs can participate. So that was some of the thinking behind having these carve-outs. So there's space in the program to do like brownfield development, and if because of economies of scale, you could definitely see more of the 2 megawatt projects being built, but by having this smaller category, that might actually make it easier for individual communities to participate. So those are just some of the highlights of the current Maryland program, and I think a really important piece of this work that's ongoing right now is just kind of seeing what has worked and what hasn't worked. And if anyone on the phone has anything, like any thoughts on those pieces, we'd love to hear them. I think this is like one step, but like Tamara said, this has been an awesome opportunity. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to so many great Marylanders on the phone. But I think I think all of us have the same goal of wanting to make this a successful program. And we're only going to get to success by including all different stakeholders and figuring out what those next steps are to refine the program and to build out more capacity and open it to more stakeholders.
Fantastic. I think we might have a question here. Let me just check.
Am I muted?
Go for it.
Oh, okay. I have a quick question. It's Robin Lewis. So what happens with low-income residents that have issues with paying their bill? So if, I know people in the community, in my community, if they get shut off by we're in Pepco, okay. If they get shut off because they didn't pay it, or how does that work? Because, they have to be reinstated. So, this happens very frequently in low income communities where you might get shut off because you didn't pay, and then you have to be turned on and they require a deposit. It's a cycle. So how is it going to deal with it? How is community solar going to handle those challenges that are faced every day by low income people?
And that's open to any of the panelists.
Well, Robin, just quickly, the individuals, anyone who signs up for community solar remains a customer of their current utility. So in Baltimore, for example, BG&E customers cannot be turned off for months. So any...
I'm sorry, it cannot be turned off when?
There was a dip in the sound, right? When you said cannot be turned off, and then it was blank, and then it was months.
During the winter months. That's through legislation.
And the winter months are considered?
After October. Yeah,
okay.
November, I think through March. So whatever the standard is for the particular utility, that's what would still exist for them. Because again, we're not taking them away from the utility. They still must be connected to the grid. So the typical regulations and rules around turnoffs or delinquencies are grandfathered in. Now, what we're trying to do, the Delegate Clipper mentioned a great individual in the community, Lynn Heller. She's working.
The Community Access Fund.
Yes, the Community Access Fund.
Right.
That is to help address the anticipated, to your point, delinquency rate. So she's providing, just to simplify it, a bit of an insurance for the developers of these systems. Because as you can imagine, the developers do want to ensure a pretty high rate of solvency among the subscribers. But what she's proposing to them is that she can provide sort of a financial fund to support possible delinquencies.
And it sounds like between Delegate Clippender's bill, the previous Lattice work, the expansion of the pilot program, and nonprofit partners like Community Access Fund, there are some proposals emerging to fill in the gap between people who want to participate and their ability to participate at a level where they're comfortable. But I really like the fact that, Kito, that you just pointed out that this community solar does not disconnect you from the grid. And it's a very different proposal than other kinds. So in the basket of things that you can do to clean up your profile, have an impact on the air quality in your community by shifting some portion of the energy that's produced on your behalf and for your use into a clean space, this is an option. This is an opportunity. This is an entry point that lots of really smart folks are thinking about ways to make sure it's available to everybody.
Well, I'm sorry, just to follow up on
you
that.
go for it.
So, because I know I'm going to be asked this question. So I can see a challenge with billing, if the cutoff doesn't get, if it stopped billing or whatever, and they have to retro bill or bill, behind. And I guess these are kinks that community solar organizations offering it will probably have to address in in your billing as you move forward. And I see that as a challenge, given I've worked on many utilities billing systems, which are nightmares. So I guess that's something that you would work out along the way. I'm assuming. I don't know what other jurisdictions and the rest of the country has done about that. So that's my concern, and that's been addressed to me by several people when I talk about community solar.
Right, and
thank you, Kito. Yes.
Just to clarify, the Lynn Heller piece, the community access fund that she's developed and is in talks with the developers, that fund would be used to cover any shortages or arrearages of a particular customer. Just to
okay. And hopefully that'll be around in everywhere, not just Baltimore, right?
Well, yeah, she's talking to developers statewide.
This Lynn Heller. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, the Community Access Fund. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
And the state legislation proposed in 2018 doesn't seem to be jurisdiction. It seems to be agnostic across jurisdictions and is at the state level. So if it is directing two different departments of the government to think about debt and arrearages and these pots of money for 2 specific years, that provides some it sounds like it provides some opportunity for folks who are currently experiencing arrearages to be captured inside of this window. But that's something we should think a little bit more about in the environmental justice legislative team, and continue to work with the bill sponsors around making sure that any companion legislation or follow-up legislation is anticipating any gaps that are discovered along the way, especially as the current problems are just getting people to adopt it. So if this is another bulwark to that, then we should think about it some more.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for your question, Robin.
That's good.
I'm gonna pivot us towards the end because we are nearing. My good God, this is a really robust conversation with a lot of smart folks around some things that are really necessary. And again, one of several conversations we need to start to have if we want communities to access community solar and to think about the ways that it plays into their own choices to make their lives better. There are some resources here. Then this PowerPoint presentation will be available on the Environmental Justice Legislative Team's webpage on the Maryland Environmental Health Network website. And so you'll be able to access this PowerPoint fairly immediately. It has explainers on community solar in case you need to talk to your local groups about how this works. And you feel free to leverage any part of this PowerPoint. There are some toolkits. There are at least 4 here, but there are several being prepared now by local groups. And so feel free to take a look at the Solar Outreach, NREL, NAACP, policies and best practices and fact sheets. And all presentations for this briefing and for any of the previous ones are available on our Environmental Justice Legislative Team website. And the next briefing will occur on October 22nd, 2018. And we'll be digging into another chapter where energy choice in the state of Maryland is impacting our communities. And the focus will be natural gas infrastructure and community health. We'll be featuring some residents from all across the state in our Community of Communities group. And Dr. Ann Bristow will be weighing in as well to talk a little bit about how community health is and is not being concerned as the state takes on proposed investments in natural gas infrastructure. And that'll occur on the 22nd from noon to 1:30 p.m. Thank you very much to each of our panelists, Jessica Ennis, Taylor Smith-Hams, Keto James, and Delegate Clippinger. Thank you so much for your participation and great questions. And I look forward to a continued dialogue on this important subject. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samara.
Thank you.
Have a great day.